Hi, for those who don't know me, my name is Amy Rowlinson. I am a coach, I'm a mastermind host, I'm a speaker, property investor, landlord, SaaS trustee, and occasionally I am an iTunes #1 podcaster. And I've been podcasting for just over a year now, so still relatively new to the space. Although I have now recorded over 150 episodes and have released over 100 episodes out into the public. So my first podcast was the Property Vault podcast, and the new one is Focus on Why. Now, I have been a keen listener and a keen podcaster, as most of you know, for a long time. And I've had the benefit of being a guest on one or two of other people's shows, and also many of you have been the guest on my show. Ruth very kindly asked me to do this presentation on podcasts, and I asked a lot of you property sisters what you might want to know so that I could prepare this presentation tailored specifically to those questions. And I'd underestimated what a popular topic podcasting would be in this property group. So I'm going to attempt to cover all that you need to know in our slot today. And let's get going. So what is a podcast? It's a digital audio file which has been made available on the internet to download to your computer or a mobile device. It's typically available as a series with new installments of which you can be received by subscribers automatically. And why the word podcast? Well, the origin is the amalgamation of two words, iPod and broadcast. So what is the history of the podcast? Podcasting previously was known as audio blogging, and it has its roots dating back to 1980s. With the advent of broadband internet access and portable digital audio playback devices such as the iPod, podcasting began to catch hold in late 2004. And it was popularized by MTV personality Adam Curry, known as the Podfather through his show Daily Source Code. And then iTunes began carrying podcasts in June 2005, and the rest is history. So how many podcasts are there in the world? Well, back in 2018, there were just 550,000 podcasts with 18.5 million episodes. And last year, in May 2019, there were 700,000 podcasts out there. This year, in January, it went up to 850,000. But since lockdown, more have popped up, and we've just surpassed 1 million podcasts. So it really is a fast growing medium, and it's expected to grow up to 1.7 million by the end of this year. So how many episodes are out there? Well, last year there were 29 million episodes to download. And this year, currently, there are 54 million, which is a huge number. And how many people tune in? Well, it is a fast growing audience, and podcasting spans over 100 languages worldwide. And there are currently 7 million, just over 7 million in the UK that tune in, which is about 1 in 8. And it's an increase of over 24% in the last year and more than double in the last 5 years. But we are a bit behind other countries. And in the US, you have a huge audience with 73 million people tuning in. And who listens to podcasts? Well, it's fairly balanced between men and women, and 23% of the UK population have listened to a podcast in the last month, and they spend an average of 3.6 hours per week listening to podcasts. 51% of UK listeners said they tune in because they find it interesting, and 26% said it was because they wanted to learn something new. Now, age groups, this is an example of how many people are listening in different groups, but it's actually 2/3 of the audience are aged between 18 and 44. And podcasts tend to attract the wealthier and more educated people, with up to 68% of the audience likely to have a university degree. So podcast listeners are also more active on social media, with 94% being active on at least one social media platform versus 81% across the entire population. So 51% of all consumers above the age of 12 listen to podcasts in US, up from 44% in 2018. So it really is a growing number of people who are listening. And how much time do they spend listening? I think this is all important for you to understand just what a great medium it is. 80% of people listen to almost all or most of a podcast episode that they tune into. And they do listen to 7 shows a week, and they subscribe to an average of about 6 different shows. And 22.4% of listeners spend more than 22 hours a week. So that's over a fifth of people who are listening to podcasts are spending that much time on podcasts. It's a really big number of hours there. And what are they listening to? Well, there are 20 main categories with several subcategories. I actually have my focus on why podcasts in 3 different categories, which are business, education, and society and culture. And within those, there are subcategories. So, for example, in business, there's entrepreneurship, careers, investing, management, marketing, and nonprofit. And I've got mine sitting in the entrepreneurship space. So here are all the different categories. Comedy and society and culture are the most popular podcasting genres, followed closely by business, news, and politics and health. And it tends to be the discussion and talk shows which are the most popular. So how are they listening? Well, majority of people, so 2/3, 65%, they are listening on their smartphones or tablets. And the number one platform that they listen to is Apple Podcasts, but there are lots of other platforms, and Spotify and Stitcher are really battling to get some attention there as well. 80% of people listen to an entire podcast episode, as I said, and it's one of the best engagement rates on any consumption medium. So more likely to use it on a mobile as well than on the web browser. And 19% of people, this is really interesting, 19% of people prefer to speed up their audio, which means the majority, 81%, listen to it at normal pace. I don't know about you, but I always have mine at normal pace just for the first few minutes, and then it goes up to 1.5 speed. And where are they listening? Well, the statistics vary from country to country, but actually the majority of people listen at home. But as we all know, podcasts do allow us to be entertained and educated on the move. So people listen to podcasts at home, in a car, on a plane, or on a train. Gosh, I can't even remember being on a train. So, and what are they doing? Well, they could be walking the dog, they could be on the gym, they could be walking, but actually 70% of people listen to podcasts without multitasking, which I find really interesting. But other people do listen while they're doing housework, or baking or cooking. And why are they listening? Well, people say they're learning to learn new things, they're acquiring new knowledge, they're being entertained, and it's a source of news and inspiration for most. It's interesting to understand, though, that 43% of people discover new shows by asking around from their friends or on social media or an online community. So it's good to know how you get your recommendations. And also, why are they not listening? So 35% of people who don't listen say it's because they don't know how to locate a podcast despite knowing what they are. Other top reasons include being unsure of how to listen to a podcast, not knowing where to start, and not really understanding what a podcast is. Now, this is a big question that people ask me. Well, how do I monetize a podcast? How do I get paid for pushing a podcast out there? And what are the monetization opportunities? Well, you can have affiliations, you can have partnerships, you can have sponsors. This is likely to happen, though, once you've been established for a while, or if you've already got a big reputation in a particular field. Look what's just happened to Joe Rogan. He's just pushed out an enormous deal with Spotify to go solo on Spotify, and that's $100 million he's just been paid. It's exactly the same setup, exactly the same production team. All he's done is he's just moved it into Spotify, so you can't listen to it on any other platforms. So podcasters are really fast becoming serious business. And what I find interesting about the sponsorship and ad revenue growth is it's gone up by 1,000% in 5 years. And a high percentage of people actually follow up on the messages that they hear on a podcast. And they've got a much higher intent to purchase. They're way higher than any other medium. And this is all to do with the know, like, and trust factor of the host who's speaking about the product. And it will really sell well then. So this is some numbers for you. In 2015, there's $105.7 million was spent on podcasting advertising. And in 2018, that went up to 479 million on podcast ads. And it's mainly in podcasts which relate to news, comedy, business, education, and entertainment. And this ad revenue is expected to reach, by the end of this year, $863 million. And it's likely to surpass 1 billion next year. So where ad avoidance plagues many marketing channels, podcasts are different. In fact, 78% of listeners actually approve of the podcast sponsorships. Why is this the case? Well, it's because the listeners make the connection that the advertising funds the content that they value, that they really truly value, and therefore the products are often aligned also with the podcast content. So they've got the right audience and they've got the right type of marketing and advertising on those particular platforms. So podcast listeners don't simply approve of the ads, they find them memorable and motivating. And data has indicated that 67% of listeners could recall products and brands featured in these ads, and 61% actually paid for a product or service they learned about it on the podcast. These are really high numbers. So you've heard the statistics, and you'll now appreciate that a podcast is a growing medium with huge opportunity to reach a global audience. It hasn't reached saturation point at all. And is a podcast going to be right for you? Why and how will having a podcast benefit you? How does it complement your business? What do you want to achieve and why do you want to achieve it? What is the intention of your podcast and why? So what is your purpose? Is it part of your business plan? We've established that this is a strong audience with a lot of potential. So the next question to ask is, why host a podcast? Well, you all know why is my favorite topic. So why do you want to have a podcast? What will it enable you to do? Is it going to be tied in with your business, or is it something that you want to do from a pleasurable point of view? Is it something you follow as a passion? If it's for business, podcasting will help you to influence and connect with your niche, your space. It will increase your visibility. It will help you build a community. It will help you build and increase credibility, promote and showcase your personal and your business brands, and it will help you become a key person of influence and authority in your field of expertise. Has the potential to make an impact on a global scale, and don't underestimate this. You will reach people and inspire them right across the world. So you're going to connect with people. You're going to be able to collaborate with people, and you're going to draw people into what you have to offer, your services, your products. And this is how you can monetize your business. You can get people, you can drive people to email lists, you can nurture them, you can help contact them, you can build communities with all these important people that you're having as an audience. And if it's not for business, you could start, as I said, a podcast for pleasure, as a hobby, talking about a passion. And there are literally podcasts out there for just about every topic that you can imagine. So whether it's for business or for fun, I just want to warn you that it can be very time consuming, and it is a commitment, because you need to be consistent to maintain a loyal audience. So let me explain and help you understand why I launched my first podcast, which was the Property Vault podcast. And at the time, Dan and I, we were having a network event, and lots of questions were being asked every month there. And we knew that there was a strong desire for more practical property information at the network events, and we just wanted to get more information out there. So we decided to take our Property Vault into the airwaves so we could share more helpful tips, practical property advice, and we could get people in and interview them. It was very congruent with what we were doing with the practical property courses that we were running and the coaching that we were delivering. And on our first day of launching, and this is a year ago, May the 1st, 2019, we hit the top 10 iTunes charts for the shows. And we stayed in the charts ever since. And we've been number one several times. Now, it's still in the charts today, even though we haven't released any new episodes since the 22nd of April. And the episodes are still being able to download, and there are lots of episodes there, and even got some property sisters. So we've got Helen Chorley, we've got Atuksha, we've got Ruth there. So there's some really great past. We've got Hazzy and Chanel. There's lots of people who have been on the Property Vault podcast from the Property Sisters. And then moving on to the focus on why. Well, what's this podcast about? Well, it's all about why people do what they do, their raison d'etre, how they combine their passion with their purpose and have a plan to achieve it. I have a fascination for understanding what drives people in life, and working with my coaching clients, the question why is at the heart of every decision. Having a podcast which focuses on why makes sense for me, as I spend so much time with this one question. So after I had the idea to launch this show, it took me just 30 days to do so. However, don't be fooled. It's taken me years to acquire all the knowledge and the tools that I needed to deliver it. It's the branding, the marketing, the interviewing skills has come from a background in recruitment and my coaching, and the books that I've read, courses I've taken, and the many mistakes that I've made. But with all of that on board, that's how I got to number 4 on my launch day and got to sit alongside the great names such as Jay Shetty, Tim Ferriss, and Tony Robbins, which is pretty cool. And it's all possible for you to do the same. So you want to set up a podcast, but how do you do it? Well, there are lots of components, as you can imagine. And if you've never hosted a podcast before, or even if you have, but it was a while ago, I would still recommend that you seek help from those who've got current experience in this ever evolving industry. Even though I thought I knew all there was to launch and host a podcast, having had the Property Vault and launching it just a year ago, I realized that there were still some areas that I wasn't quite getting right. So I sought help as to how to launch the Focus on Why podcast. And I reached out to a good friend. Her name is Anna Parker Naples, and she's also known as the Podcast Queen. And I would highly recommend the podcast membership course that she runs on a monthly subscription if you are serious about getting a podcast out. And I'll drop a link into the chat later for you. Anyone can set up and host a show. It's actually not that difficult, but you are looking at a time frame of about 8 weeks from the concept to launch if you follow the necessary steps. And again, I want you to think about why. So we've talked about the why. Now it's the what. If you've decided it's right for you, what does your podcast look like? What is the concept? What is the topic or niche and style of your podcast? Is it going to be chatty? Is it going to be formal? Are you going to have interviews? How are you going to do your branding? Now, I've done all my branding on Canva, but it's really important that your thumbnail image stands out. It needs to be a really strong imaging. You speak to Marina about branding. She's the expert. So it has to stand out amongst all of those other millions of podcasts out there. And if you're not proficient in tech, then I would get someone to help design your brand for you. And then there's also your music. It's got to be in tune with the type of style of your show. So you've got to record your intro and outro music, and you can go and find that from various platforms. Who's your audience? This is really important. And who is your competition in your field? I would recommend that you go and check them out. Look at the reviews that people have left on their shows, because you'll find out why they're listening and what they like about those particular shows. It's really important to understand your target market before you start. Do a deep dive into your ideal client avatar. Who's going to listen to your show? Really know those people in detail. So talking about the construct of the show, will it just be you? Are you going to have a co-host? Or are you going to have many co-hosts like Jo has on her Property Jam? Think about the guests. Are you going to have people on, or is it just going to be you solo? So script, are you going to have one, or are you going to go free flow? It's really important that what you're doing and how you're delivering is congruent with the rest of how you deliver your business. So I would think about the message that you want to get across to your audience. Which categories are you going to appeal to? I mentioned there were 20 earlier, and obviously there are lots of subcategories there. So think about them, because you actually only get to pick 3 categories. So when you subscribe and you put your podcast into the hosting platforms, you only get to choose 3. You can change them, but it's important to get them right from the start. So what's the content going to be? Have you planned your content? How many episodes are you going to have? How often are you going to have? Which is the best day for your audience? There's lots of questions that you'll need to think of the answers to. And how are you going to get started? How are you going to record those episodes? Well, you can do it on a budget. A Zoom recording will work just fine. All of my podcasts that I've released have been in lockdown, and they've all been on Zoom. And I have got some proper equipment. I've got some good tech. But it's really important that you have really good equipment if you want to get that really good sound quality going forward. So I use a quality microphone. I've got pop shields. I've got an audio box that feeds into my computer. I used to think that I needed to record in person with people to get that really good relationship dynamic. But I think having listened to my podcast, you'll realize that it is possible to build a really good relationship with your guests over a Zoom call. And the sound quality has been fine. It's not perfect, but it's been okay. There's been some blips in a few of the recordings. But I've been able to speak to people from all over the world, and that's been something that's really opened my eyes, that I didn't need to meet up with them. And I've had podcast guests from the States, from Japan, from Spain, from Turkey and Romania, which has been incredible. So if you're on a tight budget, you can actually do it for a relatively low costs. You can set up around about anything between £50 and £300 if you want to get some more tech. But there are also some additional costs that you need to factor in for hosting your podcast online. That you need to be able to distribute your podcast, and you have to get a platform. I use Libsyn. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And I pay around about $50 a month to host all of my podcasts so that they can be distributed across all the different platforms. But I'm going to reduce that cost down when I reduce the number of episodes that I'm going to be releasing each week. So simple equipment, that you can get a Zoom H1N, which is a portable recording device, which has a lavalier mic, which is just a clip-on mic you can put onto your shirt or your top. And it's really easy to use, and you can take it anywhere. It's how I recorded a podcast with Helen Chorley a couple of months ago for the Property Vault. And you also need to factor in time. The time to record your podcast, to edit them, to write the show notes, to do the show album art and upload each episode. So don't forget to factor that into your costs. Will you do all of these things, or will you outsource them to someone else? Now, this is a question that I get asked all the time. How do you find the great guests? Well, look at all these amazing guests that have been on my show so far, and there are many more to come. How many of these episodes have you actually tuned into? So I get asked, how did I find them? Well, what I did is I started just by going to my existing network. And then I started getting recommendations from other people. And then other people said, how about this person? How about this person? Or a friend of a friend. And actually, it's then gone out of my existing network. And I also joined the Professional Speakers Association, which has been a great source for my guests because they come from a variety of different industries. And once I had built up quite a quick reputation of my existing podcast, I started to reach out to people outside my networks and invite them in as well. So there's some various things you need to consider when you've got guests on your show. You need to really think from their perspective. It's really important to make sure your guests feel relaxed, prepared for their interviews, and also that they understand what is expected of them beforehand in terms of the shape of the conversation, how long it's going to take, what you will cover, whether they get the opportunity to re-record or say something in a different way, how you're going to introduce them, how the show is going to be released, when it's going to be released, and how we'll market it. All of these things you need to factor in and talk to with your guests. And then what about the length of the episode? It goes back to who's listening to your particular podcast. It's really important to think about the length of your podcast episode from the perspective of your listener. So if you know who your listener is going to be, how much time do they actually have to spend listening to your podcast? Have they got 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or even longer? So most of my podcast interviews tend to be anything between 35 and 45 minutes. And that seems to be a really good time to get into the sort of enough depth with my guest, as well as sort of just having the right time from the perspective of the people who are listening. And my solo ones are much shorter. They tend to be anything between sort of 14 and 25 minutes maximum. So once you've recorded your podcasts, how are you going to edit them? You can leave them just as they are, raw and rough, and with the doorbells, the coughs, the dogs barking, any mistakes, or you can just spend some time on sort of polishing them, cleaning them up and tidying up any background sounds. So this is another, again, it's time to spend that you need to factor in on cleaning up your episodes. And you can use free software to do this quite easily. It literally is quite easy to edit a podcast, even though it looks very technical with all the sound waves. It's not as difficult as it sounds. So you do need to add in music, your intro and your outro, and do your voiceover part, which again is a lot easier than you think. It's just layers of different sound waves over the top of one another, and you can move them around. So if you can copy, click and paste, then you can edit a podcast. But these are all things that you need to consider. And again, with how you're planning your content and how many episodes and what days you're going to be publishing and releasing your podcasts. So how are you going to release them? This is what I spoke about earlier. I use a platform called Libsyn, and this is a hosting platform. And again, the cost can vary. You can use a free one, but they will insert adverts and you don't have any control of where that goes in your particular content. So there's lots available out there. I like Libsyn because it also gives me fantastic statistics, and I like to see who's listening, where they're listening, which countries, how many downloads I've got on particular episodes, on particular days. It gives me all those stats. It's really useful. So with all this in mind, are you ready to launch your show? Well, you need to register with Apple. As I said, majority of people listen via Apple, so it's good to get your show validated with Apple, and then you can register with Spotify and Stitcher as well. So as soon as Apple have validated your podcast, tell everybody you know, because it needs to, you need to get as many people on board to subscribe, to download, to rate and review your podcast if you want to get into those charts. And how many downloads actually makes a successful podcast? Well, the really big shows, they're looking at around 50,000 downloads in about 30 days. And I'm looking at less than that. The average podcast will rack up around about 141 downloads in the first 30 days, but I'm above average because my podcast have now had 6 weeks out and I've got over 6,500 downloads on those podcasts. So it's doing really, really well. It's way above average, putting me in sort of between the top 5% in podcasts at 5 and 10%. And the Property Vault podcast also got into 82 countries last time I checked, with about 35,000 downloads, which is great. So what if you don't want to host a show, but you just want to be a guest? What makes a great guest? What are the benefits of being a guest? Again, it goes back to why. Why do you want to be a guest on a show? What will it achieve for you and your business? You need to check if it's the right show for you to be on. Is it congruent for your business? Is it congruent for your industry? The right target audience? And you need to be clear about the message that you're wanting to deliver before you go onto that show, and share that message with the host prior to recording. Explain what you'd like to include in the podcast and why that's important to you. But being a guest will build your visibility, it will build your credibility, and it'll give you an opportunity to introduce you to a totally new audience. And people will come to know, like, and trust you. You need to be prepared. Ask the host of the show ahead of time what they're looking to cover. Ask them for some questions that they may ask. Ask them whether you can promote your business or talk about what you're offering at the moment and how the audience can reach you. And also ask how long you'll be talking for and when it will be released, so that you can link it in with a promotion or book publication or anything that's relevant to your business and an offering that you have. So I've covered a huge amount and there is so much more, but I feel like I've given you a glimpse into the world of podcasting, and hopefully this has given you a broad understanding of the wonderful world that is podcasting. And I would recommend that you ask any of the property sisters who have already been on either the Property Vault podcast or the Focus on Why about their experiences as a guest and what messages they've received afterwards since having been on the show. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I just want to again recommend the podcast membership with Anna Parker Naples. I've got some links here, and if anybody wants to get into contact with me, here are my contact details. If you put your phone up with the camera mode up to the screen, you can connect to LinkedIn using the QR code, and there are all the rest of the links for me. And the bottom there is the podcast membership link as well. I hope that's...
Thank you, Amy. That's absolutely incredible. I mean, I knew nothing about that, so that has just blown my mind. And you know, we're also proud of you for having such a humongous podcasting all across the globe. I mean, it is quite incredible. Guys, you must have questions. So I'm going to leave it to you guys to ask some questions. Amy, did you cover monetization? Because I couldn't remember that bit.
Yeah, it's at the beginning. So you can have affiliations with people. So you can there's various ways that you can put in sponsorships with businesses. You can put it in at the beginning, the mid, or at the end of your podcast. And you can sort of open it and say, and you can either have it as a separate ad, or you can just weave it in by yourself talking. It's not something, I've got affiliations, and I have affiliations with Amazon. So if I recommend any books and people click on those links, then I can earn money from any of those downloads. I have to put that on my show notes that that's the case, and I've done that. So you can earn with just recommending books and things like that. But you could also earn, for example, with the podcast membership that I'm recommending with Anna. Again, I've got an affiliated link with her. So she's helped me hugely with my podcast, and I've got an affiliation with Anna to put people into her membership. So that's a good way of doing it. And again, as I said earlier, right at the beginning, people really trust the things that you say and the endorsements that you have on a podcast because they're very loyal to your podcast. So you need to be very mindful of who you work with, who you are affiliated with, if you are going to go into that. But it is a good way of getting money from your podcast.
What you're saying is about trust, isn't it? People trust you. They listen to you week on week, and they end up trusting you. So any brands that you end up promoting, you know, you've got to be 100% sure about those brands.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if I didn't have that trust in, for example, Anna's membership, I mean, there were things that I did not know, and I'd been putting out, I'd had 64 episodes out into the space, and I was missing a whole load of things, and I'm not going to share those now because she's worked really hard to put that membership together. But it was really invaluable for me to have spent time. I was only supposed to go in for a month because it's just a monthly membership. You can just go in and just for a month if you want to and get all the information you need and to come out. But I'm now 3 months still in the membership because she keeps adding more information, and it's so useful.
What I noticed as well is you're ranking above Rob Moore as well. So I was like, boom.
Yeah, I sent him a private message on that, and he said he was quite funny about that. It was very well received.
Anyone else got some questions, guys?
Can I ask a question? I don't know whether.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it might be a bit of an unfair question, Amy, because it's comparing YouTube with a podcast. Because I play around a little bit with YouTube, not got a major presence there, but just wondered what you see as the advantage of podcast, because podcasting is a big and growing thing, but it also seems that YouTube is a big and growing thing. Just wondered whether you've given any thought to podcasting versus YouTubing.
Yeah, so I've thought very carefully about this, and I have recorded all of my podcasts in a video format, and at one point in the future that they probably will be released onto YouTube. For me, this particular podcast has great value in the visual distraction that YouTube would have on it. I find that the podcast element of just being audio for these conversations means that people can use their own movies, play their own movies whilst they're listening, and it's more relatable in that way for the audience to have the just the audio connection. I find that sometimes the visual connection means that people then switch off from the actual things that they're seeing, and they're not really taking on board what they're hearing. So has been a distinction for me to make. Other things would, you know, if it was another podcast that actually would require something visual, then that would make more sense to go on to YouTube as well. But I like the subtle distinctions that both platforms offer. So yes, it might be that I put them out there at some point, but at the moment I'm just doing the audio version.
So does that mean you videoed all of the podcasts, Amy?
Yeah.
Oh.
I think, Louise, as well, it goes back to how people are listening to that content. So when Amy was talking about people are listening to it while they're ironing, you know, when they're doing other activities, when they're walking the dog. So it's not necessarily right for the YouTube person. So that's what gives it its differentiation, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, with that, I mean, that's something that I will mention. All of the guests that have come on the show, I get them to sign a guest release form, which allows me to use any of the material, whether it be a video or audio, because you are using, you know, their voice and their image, and it's really important that you have that permission beforehand. So just to make that point as well. Any more questions, ladies?
Hi, I've got a question. I do have a noisy background as well, so hopefully you can still hear me.
Hi.
Hi there, Amy. My question was about Anchor, like tools that you can use to podcast. Would you recommend those? That's my first question. I'll go back on mute.
So Anchor is a platform that you can use, and it's free, but I think that they put in their own adverts. So I think that's something. So again, it is free, but you don't have the control over, if you have your own platform that you use, such as Libsyn. I can push out all of my content, and I can actually retrospectively change any of the episodes as well. I can just splice in anything I need to at any point. But with Anchor, I think that's they will put an advert in any position of that particular episode. So it's a personal choice.
Awesome. And then my second question was, in terms of sponsorship, is that something like you actively seek, or do people come to you? How does that relationship happen?
A bit of both. So if you want to approach a company and say that, look, I've got this podcast, I think it would be really beneficial. In fact, with the Property Vault podcast, we did actually get a sponsor, someone who's very keen to do that, but then we decided that we weren't going to pursue the whole business anyway. So they actually approached us. So it really does depend on the success and the visibility of your particular podcast and what industry you're in and what your target market is. So if there's a company that would be suitable for that, then I would approach them definitely, and as soon as possible. But bear in mind that you need to have some kind of reputation before you do that, which will stand you in good stead. And the number of downloads will indicate that a lot of people, when you do have a sponsorship deal, they'll want to know how many downloads you get, and it will be based on that you would have sort of incremental levels of sponsorship money.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Has anyone been inspired to set up a podcast after listening to this?
Hiya, it's Dips here. I won't put video on because I look absolutely awful. Yeah, that was a really good question to segue in and say, yes, me, I have. Yeah, so I've put it out there about a week ago, very soon after actually joining the party with the Property Sisters, that I have been completely inspired by Amy. In fact, the speed at which she put the focus on my podcast out there, and the way in which it has reached the heights that it has completely inspired me, and given me the kick up the backside, I guess, and I'm giving myself the permission to get myself out of my comfort zone. So I am working on launching a podcast, and the podcast, and I've kind of mentioned it in the group as well, but my podcast is the Mums in Property podcast. I'm really excited about putting this podcast out there, really, and the purpose of it is sharing inspiring stories for women who have done amazing things and are doing amazing things in property, all whilst being mum. It's quite niche. It's a different angle to what we have available out there on all of the platforms with property. It's going to be entertaining, as well as it'll be entertaining and inspiring. Educational, maybe, I don't know. It depends on who the guest is and obviously the background of the guest as well. So I'm super excited about it. I've reached out to a number of people who have given me nothing but 100% ticks on, yes, this is a great idea. So I think that there's a fab demand for it.
And well done you, Dips, because I know that is going out massively out of your comfort zone. So really well done.
Thank you. So yeah, watch this space, everyone. I'll be certainly reaching out again to get some to basically ask for you to be a guest if you want to share your story.
Brilliant. And has anybody been inspired to be a guest on a show? I think I'm looking in the chat now, and I've just seen that Alexandra said yes, she's going to loves the idea of being a guest. So well done you. Good for you. That's brilliant news. Any more questions?
Amy, can I ask how much time? I mean, I know it's been a bit surreal during lockdown and you've been getting this off the ground and you've been sort of manically doing it. But when you're sort of settling into a bit more of a sort of regular routine of this, how much of your time do you think it's going to take up on a regular basis?
Okay, so you can break that down in how long is your episode going to be. So if you're recording an episode with a guest, you're looking at around about an hour of the time just to record it. Okay. If you're doing something that's just solo, you could put out a podcast that takes 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And that could just be something that you've recorded and you just release it. So then you need to factor in the time just of writing the show notes. So I'd put in about half an hour to an hour, depending on how much detail, and getting all the resources you need for those show notes. And the show notes is literally probably about A4 page worth of information that you upload alongside with your podcast. To then edit it, if you're going to do some cleaning up of the audio, again, I would say the length of the time of that particular podcast is going to indicate how much time, and I'd probably double it. So you're looking at that sort of time frame as well. And then the uploading takes minutes. So that's probably a time frame for each episode. So depending on how many episodes you are going to push out, that's how many times you add up all of those elements. Does that help? Okay, great.
We've got a question that's just come up. Amy, what due diligence do you do if you've been asked to appear on a podcast where you don't know the host very well?
That's a great question. Due diligence, fantastic. So what I do is I go and listen to their podcast before I even respond, and I go and see how many episodes they've done, what space they're in, what reviews have been left, see if I recognize anybody's names. If there's anybody's names there, I'll reach out to them and ask them. And you tend to get an idea also from their social media platforms, what they're up to, what they're doing, what sort of voice they have, what feedback they have, what content they're pushing out there. So I will look at all of those and then decide whether it's something that's right for me to be on, and if it's congruent with what I want to achieve.
I had a request for a podcast quite recently, and the gentleman in question actually sent me a survey to fill out to say, oh, I really want you on my podcast, but can you fill out this form first and let me know why you should be on it? And I must say, I took a bit of offence to that, because I thought, actually, you haven't researched me at all. You know, I went back to him and I said, no, I'm not going to appear, but these are the reasons why, because you've asked me to fill out this form and you're asking me why I should appear. Have you ever heard of that before?
I have, actually. So when I approached Sam Rathling, I had to fill in, it was 2 or 3 pages of various content, because she gets approached so many times and she just wanted to filter out for her whether it was worth her time to come on to my podcast. And so I filled out all of those different areas for her. So that's slightly different, because it was me asking someone else and then justifying why it would be of benefit to her. But if you flip that round, he's probably doing the same of why you're going to benefit him for you to be on the show, what your audience is, and what the benefits are, because it is time. So you do need to be really mindful of your time and respect your time. So I think that, you know, to understand what the benefits are for both parties up front is a good idea.
I just think it would have taken me half an hour to fill out the form, you know, and I just got offended by it, because it had, what is your name, you know, what kind of business are you in? And it just showed to me the lack. What he'd actually done is he was doing a women in property series, and I know that he'd contacted a few of the sisters and it asked exactly the same questions.
Yeah.
So I know that he had put no time in whatsoever. So
that's different. That's lazy.
Yeah.
And I might have received that form too.
Snap. Sorry, I'll just put that in there. I think I know exactly what you're talking about, who you're talking about as well. I think there is that level of being offended slightly as well. And it makes you think that it goes back to the whole not divide, but, you know, the whole women versus men thing and how they think, and what it is that is worthwhile, what's high on their agenda, and whether it's worth them giving you that time. So it was like, okay, not yet, no thanks.
and men are completely black and white, right? And whereas we're more emotional, so you know, it's approaching maybe your guests with that in mind, you know.
I think also, just to mention on that a lot of the podcasts that I've put out there, there's been quite a few emotional ones because of the content of my podcast, and I think that's something that when you're looking to be a guest, just be prepared for how much you're going to share, because you can quite quickly get into a space where you might share things that you might not want to. So that just be really mindful of what it is you're sharing and who you're sharing it with, and just be a bit careful about that, because you don't want it's fine in the space that I've got here. We talk about what we want to share and how we want to share that. But on other podcasts, especially if it's a business podcast, how much information are you giving out that could be private information with your business? So just be mindful.
Well, that's fantastic, Amy. I think we're at the end now of our session, but I just wanted to say a big thank you to Amy. You know, she spent a lot of time putting that presentation together, and it's fantastic. So I'm looking forward to getting that uploaded onto our YouTube as well. So yeah, just a big thanks from all the property sisters today.
Thank you, ladies.
And I think that's it. So have a fantastic weekend, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Subscribe to my podcast.